10 years. That's exactly how long I've kept this secret, burying it so deep that at times it felt as if I'd made it all up. But nightmares don't lie, and the scar on my left shoulder, where the claws tore into my skin, serves as a constant reminder that what happened to me in the Appalachians was horrifyingly real. My name is Kelly Denver, and I'm finally ready to tell my story. It was October 15th, 2014, and I'd been planning this solo hike for several months. The fall beauty of the Appalachians was in full swing, and I chose a moderately difficult route in the remote Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 miles southwest of Asheville, North Carolina. The weather forecast promised clear skies and a temperature of about 15 degrees. Perfect conditions for a hike. However, I wasn't entirely alone. My faithful companion, Scout, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix whom I rescued from a shelter in Charlotte, ran alongside me with the kind of enthusiasm only a dog can muster during a mountain adventure. Scout had accompanied me on dozens of hikes, and his protective instincts had saved us from trouble with aggressive wildlife more than once. He was my hiking partner, my safety net, and my best friend, all rolled into one loyal creature. We set out early, around 6:30 a.m. at the trailhead, where on busy weekends you might see a dozen hikers. This wasn't one of those Instagram-famous trails with wooden signs and well-maintained facilities. This was the wilderness, a place where cell service drops out after just the first kilometer and where you can walk for hours without seeing a soul. The trail wound through dense, deciduous forests where massive oaks and maples formed such a thick canopy that even at noon, the forest floor remained dark and cool. Centuries-old rhododendron bushes created natural tunnels along the trail, and their twisted branches formed arches that made it feel as though I were walking through an abandoned cathedral. The first 6 hours went perfectly. Scout and I walked at a steady pace, stopping from time to time so I could take pictures of particularly stunning views or interesting rock formations. The autumn air was fresh and clean, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant sound of a stream rolling over the rocks. Around noon, we reached what I considered the halfway point of our planned route. I took out my map and GPS to check our location while Scout sniffed around a fallen tree. According to my calculations, in an hour, we were supposed to reach the overlook I was aiming for, and then begin our descent back to the trailhead. But after studying the map closely, I realized I'd made a navigational error. About 2 miles back, we'd taken a fork in the trail that had led us deeper into the wilderness than I'd anticipated. Instead of being halfway through a perfectly manageable day hike, we were now forced to take a much longer route through unfamiliar terrain. The dog didn't seem bothered by this turn of events, wagging his tail as he explored every interesting scent. I decided to keep going rather than turn back. After all, I was an experienced hiker with the proper gear, plenty of water, and emergency supplies. What could possibly go wrong? The answer came 3 hours later, when a perfect day turned into my worst nightmare. For most of the day, we climbed steadily up the mountain, following the ridge, which occasionally offered views of the valleys below. The trail was becoming less and less distinct, looking more like an animal trail marked by occasional tracks on the trees. I had just started to think we should turn back when Scout suddenly stopped. He pricked up his ears, and his body tensed in readiness for danger. I had learned to trust Scout's instincts completely. When he was this alert, it meant something was wrong. I froze, scanning the forest around us for signs of danger. The afternoon silence had grown unusually thick. There was no bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It seemed even the wind had died down, and then I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, barely visible in the mottled shadows, a huge reddish silhouette moved smoothly and gracefully among the trees. A puma. A chill ran down my spine. In all my years of hiking, I had never once encountered these predators, though I knew they inhabited these mountains. The cat was enormous, easily 2 meters long, not counting its tail. With powerful shoulders and hind legs that spoke of explosive strength, it moved with the effortless confidence of a creature that had never encountered anything it couldn't kill. Scout spotted it too. The fur on his back bristled and a low growl escaped his throat. I grabbed him by the collar, trying to calm him down, while all the books I'd ever read about surviving in the mountains flashed through my mind. If you encounter a cougar, don't run. Try to make yourself look bigger. Back away slowly. Under no circumstances turn your back on the animal. But this cat wasn't behaving the way the textbooks described. Instead of avoiding contact with people, it was moving purposefully toward us. Its yellow eyes were fixed on me with such intensity that I got goosebumps. This was no chance encounter. This was a predator that had made a decision. I began to back away, taking one slow step after another, trying to keep Scout behind me. The cougar mirrored my movements, keeping its distance while simultaneously blocking our path of retreat. It was hunting us, and it was doing so with such cunning that I became afraid. "Calm down, boy," I whispered to Scout, who was trembling as he tried to suppress his protective instincts. "Calm down." But Scout knew what I was trying to deny. We were in serious trouble. The attack came without warning. In an instant, the cougar was 50 yards away from us. The next moment, it was already in the air, having closed the distance between us with 3 powerful leaps. I managed to let out a single muffled scream before 150 pounds of muscle and claws slammed into my chest, sending me flying backward into a tree. And that's when Scout made his decision. Even as I was falling, even as its claws pierced my shoulder and the cougar's breath burned my nostrils, Scout lunged at the cougar. 60 pounds of protective fury slammed into the cougar's side, knocking it off me and sending both animals tumbling into the underbrush. Then came the most horrific sound I'd ever heard. A mixture of growls, screeches, and wet sounds of claws and teeth sinking into flesh. I scrambled to my feet, my left shoulder burning from the puma's blow, and frantically looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but to me it felt like an eternity. Scout was brave and strong, but he was no match for the puma. I knew that, and I think he knew it too. But he'd made his choice and was going to win every second he could for me. "Scout!" I shouted, frantically looking around for a big stick or a rock. Anything that might even the odds. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fight was over. The cougar emerged from the bushes with blood on its muzzle, dragging Scout's lifeless body behind it. My beautiful, brave dog was dead. His neck had been broken by a bite that shattered his spine. The cougar looked at me again, as if wondering whether I was worth its attention. Then it dragged Scout's body deep into the woods and vanished, leaving me alone with my grief and horror. I remember almost nothing from the few hours that followed. I know I cried until I had no tears left. I know I called out Scout's name until I was hoarse, even though I watched as his lifeless body was carried away. I know I tried to retrace our steps along the same path we'd taken, but shock and grief clouded my mind. The bleeding from my shoulder had almost stopped, but the wound was deep and required proper medical attention. But at that moment, I was completely overcome by my emotions. Without even realizing it, I had strayed from the trail and now found myself in the middle of the forest, completely disoriented. The sun was setting and the temperature was starting to drop. I had a small first aid kit, a survival blanket, and a few energy bars in my backpack, but I wasn't prepared to spend the night in the wilderness. I had planned to be back at the car by 6 in the evening and then drive home to Charlotte to take a hot shower and have dinner. Instead, I was wandering through a dense forest, trying to find my way back to the trail, still reeling from the shock of my best friend's death after he saved my life. Every shadow looked like a cougar to me. Every sound made me jump. I was acting purely on adrenaline and a primal instinct for survival. When it got dark, I realized I needed to stop and find shelter. Hiking in the dark, especially in my emotional state, was a sure recipe for disaster. I could have fallen off a cliff, tumbled into a ravine, or simply gotten even more lost than I already was. I found a small clearing near a rocky outcrop that offered some protection from the wind. Using my emergency supplies, I built a makeshift shelter and tried to settle in for the night, which I knew would be the longest of my life. The first sounds came around 10 o'clock that evening. I was sitting curled up in my emergency blanket, trying to stay warm and fall asleep, fighting waves of grief over Scout's death, when I heard something moving in the woods around me. These weren't the quiet sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business. It was something large, moving with a specific purpose. At first, I thought the cougar had returned. Maybe it had finished with Scout and decided I was worth hunting after all. I grabbed the thickest stick I could find and tried to press myself against the rock behind me. But as the sounds grew closer, I realized it wasn't a cat. The movements were too heavy, too purposeful, and there was more than one of them. I could hear several large figures moving through the woods, as if surrounding me. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural sound, almost like speech. It wasn't a human voice, but it wasn't quite an animal's either. It was something in between, something that suggested intelligence and purpose. The sounds grew closer and I began to make out massive figures moving among the trees. They were enormous, much larger than any human, moving upright on 2 legs, but with a hunched, ape-like posture. In the darkness, I could barely make out their silhouettes, but what I saw defied explanation. I found myself on the verge of an encounter with creatures I had, until that moment, considered nothing more than folklore characters and video hoaxes. They surrounded me with such coordination that it became clear this wasn't the first time they'd done this. In an instant, I found myself alone in my makeshift shelter. The next moment, I was surrounded by 4 enormous figures that blocked out the stars. Up close, they looked even more terrifying than I had imagined. They stood between 2 and 2.5 meters tall and were covered in coarse, dark fur that seemed to absorb the meager moonlight filtering through the treetops. Their faces were a nightmarish mixture of human and ape features, with pronounced brow ridges, deep-set eyes, and powerful jaws. But it was their eyes that frightened me the most. They revealed an intelligence that was undoubtedly conscious, undoubtedly self-aware. I screamed and tried to run away, but there was nowhere to run. When I dashed to the left, one of them simply stood in my path, blocking the way with his massive body. When I turned to the right, another was standing there, watching me with his frighteningly intelligent eyes. The largest of the group, the one I later took to be the leader, made a sound that was perhaps a signal to the others. Before I could react, huge hands grabbed me and lifted me off the ground as easily as I might lift a small child. I struggled with all my might, kicking, screaming, and scratching at the hands that held me. But it was useless. These creatures possessed strength beyond human comprehension. The one carrying me might just as easily have been carrying a struggling kitten. That's how futile my resistance was. As they began to make their way through the forest, passing me from one to another, I heard something that made me stop struggling and listen. It was the howl of wolves in the distance. Not just 1 or 2, but a whole pack. And they were getting closer. Then I heard something else. A low cough that I recognized from nature documentaries. A black bear. And, judging by the sound, it was very close. Suddenly, I began to understand what was happening. These creatures weren't kidnapping me. They were saving me. The forest, which had seemed gloomy and terrifying to me, turned out, apparently, to be full of predators converging on me. The cougar that had killed Scout might have been just the beginning of my troubles. As if to confirm my suspicions, one of the creatures made a sound that was almost like speech, a series of low growls and grunts that, for some reason, instilled confidence. The message was that they had no intention of harming me. They were taking me to a safe place. The path through the forest seemed endless. My captors, or rescuers, I was no longer sure which was which, moved with surprising stealth for creatures of that size. It seemed as though they knew exactly where they were going, following paths invisible to me through terrain where a human would be unable to find their way in the dark. We climbed steadily upward, sometimes moving along what seemed to be well-trodden paths, and other times scrambling over rocky terrain, where all 4 creatures had to work in unison to pass safely. As they carried me, I heard the sound of water in the distance. It wasn't the small stream I'd heard before, but something much larger, perhaps a river or a waterfall. After what felt like hours, but probably lasted no more than 45 minutes, we emerged from the dense forest into more open terrain. In the moonlight, I saw that we were on a rocky slope near the very top of the ridge. A cliff loomed above us in the darkness, and it was toward that cliff that my captors were heading. At first, I couldn't figure out where they were taking me. The rock seemed massive, with no openings large enough for creatures of their size to crawl through. But as we got closer, I realized that what had looked like a shadow on the rock was actually the entrance to a cave. Not a small cave, but a huge opening that disappeared into the mountain. The entrance was hidden by an overhanging rock and partially obscured by vegetation, so it was almost invisible from a distance. These creatures had chosen their refuge well. A person could walk past this spot hundreds of times and never guess that there was a cave system here. When we entered the cave, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air took on the characteristic mineral scent of underground spaces. But this wasn't just any cave. It was enormous. The entrance hall was lost in the darkness, and the passages branched off in different directions. The ceiling was so high that I couldn't make it out in the dark, and the space seemed boundless and ancient. The creatures moved through the cave system with the confidence of those who had long been familiar with this place. They knew exactly where they were going, navigating by touch and by the sounds in the passages, which branched off and diverged in such a way that I would have gotten hopelessly lost. A few minutes later, as we moved deeper into the cave, I began to notice something strange on the walls. One of my captors pulled out something that looked like a primitive torch, a burning stick wrapped in some kind of material. I saw that the cave walls were covered with symbols. These were not natural formations, but symbols deliberately carved or painted onto the stone. These symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were not alphabetic, like English, or pictographic, like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were geometric patterns, spirals, lines, and shapes that seemed to follow some kind of internal logic I couldn't understand. Some of them looked very old, worn down by time and moisture. Others looked fresher, their lines sharp and clear. This wasn't just a cave where these creatures took shelter. It was their home, and it had been their home for a very long time. Finally, we reached what appeared to be the central chamber, much more spacious than the passageways we had been walking through. The creature carrying me gently set me down on the ground, and I found myself in a space that defied my expectations of what a cave should look like. The hall was enormous, the size of a large church, with a high ceiling that disappeared into the darkness above my head. The floor was mostly level, covered with something like sand or fine gravel. Along the walls, I saw even more mysterious symbols, and in several places, there were sections that looked as if they had been deliberately shaped or carved out. But what struck me most was how alive this space seemed. It wasn't just a cave, it was a home. There were areas that clearly served different purposes. Sleeping quarters lined with something resembling animal hides, places where fires had been lit repeatedly, and areas that, by all appearances, were used for cooking. One of the creatures, not the leader, but one of the others, approached me, carrying something in the flickering light of a torch. I saw that it was food, berries, some kind of nuts, and something that looked like strips of meat. The meat was raw, and I had no idea what kind of animal it came from. The creature set the food down in front of me and stepped back, watching me with its intelligent eyes. The message was clear. Eat. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since I'd had an energy bar that morning, but the raw meat made me feel sick. The berries looked perfectly edible, though I couldn't tell what kind they were. I was afraid to refuse. These creatures had saved me from some danger lurking in the forest, but I didn't know what their intentions were. Were they being kind to me? Or were they simply preparing me for some purpose I couldn't even imagine? The stories I'd heard about encounters with snow people ranged from benevolent to terrifying, and I had no way of knowing which category this creature fell into. So I ate. The berries were tart and slightly sweet, not unpleasant to the taste. The nuts were harder but had a rich, earthy flavor. The meat. I tried not to think about what it might be. It was tough and had a strong gamey flavor, but I forced myself to swallow it. I needed protein, and I had to show these creatures that I appreciated their gift. As I chewed, they watched me with something resembling approval. The leader made a few more low, grunting sounds, perhaps a form of communication, and the others responded in kind. I had the distinct impression that they were discussing me, deciding what to do with me once I finished eating. They seemed satisfied. The leader pointed to a corner of the room where animal hides had been arranged to resemble a sleeping area. The message was clear. Rest. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, and the adrenaline that had been keeping me going until then had finally run out. I curled up on the hides, which turned out to be surprisingly warm and soft, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. My shoulder throbbed from the puma's bite, and my heart ached with longing for Scout. But I was alive. These creatures, whatever they were, had saved my life. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear them moving about the cave, settling in for the night. But I slept restlessly. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the shadows around me sent a rush of adrenaline through my body. I was safe, but at the same time, I was a prisoner in a cave system inhabited by creatures that shouldn't exist. I must have dozed fitfully for several hours, but I woke up long before dawn. The cave was dark, except for the faint glow of embers from a fire lit in what appeared to be a natural hearth. The creatures seemed to be asleep, and I could hear the slow, deep breathing of large animals at rest. This was my chance to look around, to try to figure out where I was and what I was dealing with. Moving as quietly as possible, I got up from my makeshift bed and began to survey the hall. In the dim light of the dying fire, the cave system turned out to be even more extensive than I had imagined. Passages led off from the main chamber in 6 different directions, disappearing into the darkness. Some were wide enough for creatures to pass through easily, while others were narrower, suitable for creatures of human height. The walls were covered with symbols wherever I looked. Some were deeply carved into the stone. Others were drawn with something resembling natural pigments. The older symbols were weathered and difficult to make out, but the newer ones were sharp and clear. Someone or something had been creating these symbols for a very long time, but what I discovered in one of the side passages truly amazed me. Walking down a narrow corridor leading from the main hall, I discovered something that could only be described as a gallery. The walls were covered with images. Not just abstract symbols, but actual drawings. There were images of animals I recognized: deer, bears, cougars, wolves. But there were also depictions of the creatures themselves, captured in various situations. In some of them, they were shown while hunting. In others, they appeared to be in social groups. There were images that resembled families, adults and smaller figures who might have been children. But the most surprising of all were the images of people. There weren't many of them, but enough to understand that contact had already taken place between these creatures and humans in the past. Some of the human figures appeared to be running away. Others, it appeared, were interacting peacefully with these creatures. In one image, a human and one of these creatures were moving a large stone together. The implications of this discovery were staggering. This was not just a cave where unknown species took shelter. It was a chronicle of their existence, their culture, and their history. These creatures had lived in these mountains for a very long time, long enough to form a complex society and establish a relationship with humans that lasted for several generations. As I studied the images, I began to understand something else as well. These were not just primitive animals. They were intelligent, perhaps just as intelligent as humans, but with a completely different way of life. They had chosen to remain in hiding to avoid contact with the modern world, but they had their own rich culture and history. My exploration eventually led me to another room, smaller than the main one, but still quite spacious. What I discovered there left me frozen in horror and awe. 4 enormous creatures were sleeping together in a corner of the room, curled up like a single family. 2 of them were gigantic. They easily stood 2.5 meters tall, even while lying down. The other 2 were smaller, but still much larger than any human. A family of Bigfoots, parents and their adult children, or perhaps brothers and sisters who had decided to stay together. In their sleep, they looked less threatening than they had in the darkness outside. Their facial features were more relaxed, more human. I could make out a family resemblance in their faces, in the way they had settled in to share warmth and comfort. It was a surprisingly human behavior, and it made me see these creatures in a completely different light. They weren't monsters. They were a people, different from humans, but still a people. They had families, they had emotions, they had a community. The one who carried me through the forest wasn't kidnapping me. He was saving me, taking me to a safe place, just as any human would have done upon seeing someone in distress. But as I watched them sleep, I also felt a sense of urgency growing inside me. Dawn was approaching. I noticed a faint light beginning to seep in through the cave's entrance, and I realized this was my chance to leave. I didn't know what these creatures' long-term plans were for me, and I wasn't ready to find out. I needed to get back to civilization to have my shoulder treated, to a world where everything made sense. I needed to properly mourn Scout, come to terms with what had happened to me, and decide what to do with the knowledge I'd gained, if anything at all. Moving as quietly as possible, I returned to the main hall. The creatures that had brought me here were still asleep, and I could see the passage leading to the entrance. If I was careful, I might be able to slip away before they woke up. Getting out of the cave turned out to be harder than I'd expected. The passages, which had seemed simple when I was being carried, now resembled a maze. I took a few wrong turns, ending up in rooms I hadn't seen before, and had to go back and try other paths. But in the end, I found my way to the entrance. The morning light streaming into the cave was the most beautiful I had ever seen. I was only a few hundred meters from freedom. As I headed toward the entrance, I heard sounds. Behind me, the creatures were waking up. I could hear voices, those low, grunting sounds that I now recognized as their way of communicating. They had probably discovered that I was gone and were trying to figure out what to do about it. I reached the entrance just as the sun rose over the ridge. In daylight, the forest looked completely different. Less threatening, more familiar. I could see the slope we'd climbed the night before, and beyond it, the forest where I'd gotten lost. But I was no longer lost. From the high ground at the cave entrance, I could make out familiar landmarks. In the distance, I could make out something that looked like a trail. Not the one I'd been on when Scout was killed, but another one that seemed to run along the ridge. I didn't look back as I began my descent. I was afraid that if I looked back, I would see the creatures pursuing me, and I wasn't ready for another encounter. I needed time to process what had happened, to figure out how to return to normal life with the knowledge I now possessed. The descent was dangerous. The slope was steep and rocky, and my shoulder was stiff and sore from the puma's attack. But adrenaline and the hope of rescue kept me moving forward. I slipped and stumbled several times, but kept moving, driven by the need to put more distance between myself and the cave. It took me 6 hours to reach the trail I'd seen at the cave's entrance. By then, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and in severe pain. But I was so happy. I was back on the trails, back in a world I understood. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked. It was nothing like that primitive trail I'd been walking on when Scout died. I walked along it, knowing that eventually it would lead me back to the trailhead, to the parking lot, to some sign of human civilization. 2 hours later, I saw the most long-awaited sight of my life. A group of 3 hikers was coming up the trail toward me. They were middle-aged, well-equipped, and clearly experienced. When they saw me, dirty, bloodied, and clearly in distress, they immediately offered their help. "Are you all right?" asked the first of them, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes. I almost burst into tears right then and there. These were the first normal people I'd seen since this nightmare began, and they embodied everything I'd feared I'd never experience again. Human kindness, human civilization, human reason. "I need help," I managed to say. "I was attacked by a mountain lion. My dog is dead." They didn't hesitate. One of them, the man with the first aid kit, immediately began examining the wound on my shoulder. Another called an ambulance on a satellite phone. The third, the very woman who had spoken first, simply sat next to me and let me talk it out. I told them about the cougar attack, about Scout's heroic sacrifice, about how I'd gotten lost in the woods. But I didn't tell them about those creatures. I couldn't. How could I explain that I'd spent the night in a cave system with a family of snow people? How could I describe the symbols on the walls, the intelligence in their eyes, the way they saved my life? They would have thought I was in shock, that I was hallucinating due to trauma and hypothermia. They would have been sympathetic, but they wouldn't have believed me. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe some secrets are better left unsaid. Rescuers found us on the trail 3 hours later. I was taken to a hospital in Asheville, where doctors cleaned and stitched up the wound on my shoulder and treated me for dehydration and hypothermia. The wound was deep, but clean, and it healed without any lasting effects. The hardest part was calling my family and telling them what had happened. My parents were devastated about Scout. They loved him almost as much as I did. My sister burst into tears when I told her how he had died saving my life. They all wanted to know how I'd survived the night alone in the woods, and I told them a carefully edited version of the truth. I told them that I'd found a cave where I could take shelter, that I had some extra food in my backpack, and that I was lucky to find a trail the next morning. It wasn't a complete lie. I really did find shelter. I was well fed. I was lucky. I just left out the part about who had provided me with shelter and food. The authorities treated me with sympathy, but proceeded very cautiously. They wanted to know exactly where the cougar attack had occurred, whether I thought the animal might still be in the area, and whether any trails should be closed or warning signs posted. I gave them the most accurate information I had about where I believed Scout had died. But I did not reveal the exact location of the cave where I had spent the night. A search party set out to find Scout's body but never found it. Apparently, the cougar had dragged him so far away that he was lost in the vast expanse of the forest. I held a small memorial service in my backyard, attended only by my family and a few close friends. I told them stories about all our adventures, about what a brave and loyal friend he was, but I didn't tell them about his final heroic act. It was too painful, too personal. Besides, there were secrets involved that I wasn't ready to share. For 10 years, I kept what happened to me in that cave a secret. I started hiking again, though I never go alone, and I never go to that particular part of the mountains. I read everything I could find about Yeti sightings, cryptozoology, and the legends and tales passed down from generation to generation. Some of the stories I've read are clearly hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity. Others are much harder to dismiss. These accounts reveal patterns and coinciding details that suggest that at least some of the witnesses may have encountered something real. Descriptions of intelligent beings, their deliberate avoidance of humans, and their defensive behavior toward those they consider harmless. This matches my own experience. I considered telling someone, sharing my story with researchers or investigators, but I also thought about those beings who saved my life, about the family I saw, sleeping peacefully in their hidden cave. They had survived by staying in hiding, avoiding contact with the modern world. Did I have the right to expose them? The symbols on the cave walls bore witness to a culture with roots stretching back centuries, perhaps even millennia. These creatures had lived in the mountains longer than humans had kept written records. They had created their own society, their own way of life, and their own relationship with the natural world. What would happen if the world learned of their existence? Would they be protected, studied, respected, or would they be persecuted, hunted, exploited? Would tourists flood their territory? Would scientists want to study them? Would governments want to control them? I think about the intelligence I saw in their eyes, about how they communicated with one another, about the care with which they fed me and gave me shelter. They were not animals. They were people, just different, not like us. They deserved the same respect, the same right to privacy and self-determination that we would want for ourselves. So why am I finally breaking my silence? Why am I sharing this story which I've kept hidden for 10 years? Partly because I'm tired of carrying this burden alone. This experience changed me, and I'm still discovering new facets of those changes. I now view the natural world differently, with a deeper understanding of its mysteries and greater respect for the unknown. I've become more cautious about human arrogance, our assumption that we understand everything about the world around us. But mainly because I believe this story needs to be told, even if people don't believe it. There are things in this world we don't understand. Beings that go beyond the limits of our current knowledge. The mountains are full of mysteries, and some of those mysteries may turn out to be important. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not presenting any evidence, nor am I calling for a scientific investigation. I'm simply sharing what happened to me, what I went through and what I learned. Draw your own conclusions. The beings who saved my life that night showed me kindness and compassion when I was at my most vulnerable. They could have left me to die in the woods. They could have let the wolves and bears find me. They could have simply ignored my presence. Instead, they chose to help, protect, and care for someone who wasn't even one of them. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you believe in this source or not. I still miss Scout every day. His death was the price of my survival, and I always carry that burden with me. But I also carry within me the memory of his courage, his devotion, his willingness to sacrifice himself for the one he loved. The moment the cougar attacked me, he didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do, and he did it. The creatures in the cave showed me a different kind of courage. The courage to help a stranger. To share their resources with someone who could never repay them, to show compassion, even if it meant revealing their existence to an outsider. They took a risk by helping me, and I tried to repay them for that risk by keeping their secret. But secrets have a way of demanding to be revealed, and this secret had been weighing on me for too long.